My father drove a nail into that crossbeam the year I was born, 1965, to hang a kerosene lantern while he finished laying the floor joists. The nail is still there. The crossbeam is still there too, cracked now through the grain on the left side where the pressure hit it hardest, split maybe a quarter-inch deep along a run of about 14 inches. I have never replaced it. People ask me why not, and I tell them I haven't gotten around to it, which is a lie. I leave it there because taking it down and putting up a new one would feel like saying, the night of November 17th, 2019 was something I could just fix and move past. I cannot fix it. I have not moved past it. My name is Ray Tucker. I am 58 years old now, and I have farmed this same 118 acres in the Clinch Mountain foothills of eastern Tennessee my whole working life. My grandfather broke the ground. My father kept it. I kept it after him. I have calved heifers in February cold, pulled fence wire in July heat, sat with sick animals through the night more times than I can count. I know this land the way you know a room you have lived in for 30 years with the lights off. I know where the ground softens after rain and where it stays firm. I know which tree line the wind comes through first in November and which corner of the near pasture holds frost longest in the mornings. I am telling you all of that because I need you to understand what kind of man I was before that Sunday morning. Not a superstitious man, not a man who told stories about things in the dark. I was the man other people came to when they wanted a plain answer, a straight number, a reason why the animal was acting strange. I had reasons for everything. 30 years of reasons stacked up like fence posts, and I trusted every one of them. I don't trust them the same way anymore. If you have seen something out there yourself, something that wouldn't fit any category you had, leave a comment below. I read every one. It helps to know I am not alone in this. My brother Denny drove up from Maynardville that Friday, the 15th. He came every fall for deer season, same as he had since our father passed and left the farm to the two of us. Denny is 4 years younger than me, 50 years old at the time, and he works finishing carpentry for a contractor in Union County. He is quiet in the way practical men are quiet, which means he talks when there is something to say and doesn't when there isn't. We had a heifer, a 3-year-old I'd been watching since Tuesday, who had gone off her feed and was showing some stiffness in her hindquarters. I wanted to move her from the far pasture into the near barn where I could keep an eye on her, and it's easier to move a reluctant animal with 2 people than 1. Denny brought a 6-pack of Popst and a bag of his wife Karen's peanut butter cookies, and we got the heifer into the stall without too much trouble by about 6 in the evening. She was anxious, which I expected, but she took some water from the bucket, and I felt like she'd settle. We ate dinner, talked about deer sign Denny had noticed along the east fence line, watched part of a football game. Cleet spent the evening on the porch rug the way he always did, a 14-year-old blue heeler going gray around the muzzle, still solid across the chest, still watching the yard the way he'd watched it his whole life. I had found Cleet as a pup in the ditch off Route 33 in the fall of 2005, and he had never spent a night off this property since. He knew every sound this farm made, and he knew which ones were worth his attention and which ones weren't. I trusted his read on things almost as much as my own. Saturday was a plain day, cold and dry, the kind of November cold that doesn't bite but reminds you it could. Denny sat in his ground blind off the east fence for 4 hours in the morning and saw nothing he wanted to shoot. I ran fence in the back 40 in the afternoon and then checked the heifer twice. She was eating a little by evening, which was a good sign. Denny made a pan of eggs and toast for dinner, and we turned in early, him in the spare room upstairs, me in the bedroom at the back of the house. I woke up around 11 that night. Not from any sound I could name, just that particular kind of waking that feels like something tugged a thread. I lay in the dark for a minute, and then I heard it from somewhere outside past the near barn, coming from the tree line to the south. Coyotes. Except the sound was wrong in a way I could not immediately say. Coyotes in this country do a kind of rolling, descending yip and howl sequence that I have heard 1,000 times, and what I was hearing had the shape of that sound without having its quality. Like someone had heard coyotes described, but had never actually listened to them. Too low in the middle register. Too deliberate in the spacing between calls. I lay there and I told myself it was the rut pushing coyotes into unusual territory, which happens in November. I told myself the acoustics off Clinch Mountain do strange things to sound at night, which is also true. I got up, looked out the back window at the dark yard, saw nothing moving, and went back to bed. Cleet was not on his porch rug when I looked out. I noticed that and filed it as him having gone around to the back stoop, which he did sometimes in cold weather. I did not go outside to check on him. I've thought about that since. Sunday morning I was up before 4:30, which is not unusual for me during a busy week. The house was quiet. Denny still asleep, the furnace running its low hum through the floor vents. I put on my work pants and my canvas barn coat, laced my boots at the kitchen table, and poured a cup of coffee from the pot I'd set on a timer the night before. 30 years of the same morning. The mug was a green ceramic thing with a chip in the handle that my daughter Lena had given me for Father's Day sometime in the early 2000s. I drank about half of it standing at the window looking out at the yard. The yard was dark. The security light on the barn's south wall was on, the way it always was, throwing a cone of yellow over the gravel between the house and the barn doors. The distance from my kitchen window to those doors is about 80 yards, and I have crossed it so many times that I could do it in my sleep, and still land my foot on the same flat stone just inside the barn entrance. I went outside at 4:48. I know that because I looked at the clock on the microwave before I opened the back door. The cold hit me the way it does in November, clean and still. No wind, temperature somewhere in the upper 20s. I crossed the yard. Gravel crunched under my boots. The security light decky put my shadow out ahead of me, long and thin, pointing toward the barn doors. I was about 20 yards from the barn when everything went quiet. Not gradually. Not a sound falling away here and there. Everything all at once, as if someone had pulled a plug. The 3 roosters I kept near the equipment shed silent. The 2 horses in the paddock off the south side, no movement, no breath sound, no hoof shift. Even the wind, which had not been much to begin with, stopped. I have stood in quiet fields my whole life, and I know what field quiet sounds like. This was something different. This was the quiet of things that have decided not to announce themselves. I stopped walking. I stood in the gravel between the house and the barn for a full 30 seconds, maybe more. And I listened to that silence, and I tried to find the edges of it. I could not find the edges. It went as far as my ears could reach and then kept going. I told myself a large predator had come close, a bobcat maybe, or a dog pack, something that had put the animals on alert. That happens. I'd seen it before. I told myself it, and I stood there, and the silence held, and then I started walking again because the heifer was inside, and she was my responsibility. I opened the near barn door, the big hinged one on the east face, and stepped inside. The security light from outside threw a strip of yellow across the floor through the gap I'd come through, and I had my small flashlight in my coat pocket, which I clicked on when I let the door swing mostly shut behind me. The interior smelled the way a barn smells in November: hay and grain dust and animal warmth, and the particular damp wood smell of old framing holding its cold. I had a single work light on a cord that I could clip to one of the overhead joists, and I crossed to where it hung on a nail and clipped it up and pulled the chain. The heifer was in the far left stall. She had pressed herself into the back corner of it, and I mean pressed, the way a calf does when it has been badly frightened. Shoulder blades hard against the boards, head low, front legs braced. Her flanks were wet, not lightly damp the way an animal gets when it's been lying down, but wet through, dark across the belly and down both shoulders. She was lathered the way a horse gets in a hard run, which I had never seen in a cow in a standing stall. The whites of her eyes were showing full half moons of white around each iris, and she was not looking at me. She was looking at the west wall of the barn, the wall that faced the tree line. I stood in the center aisle, and I looked at her for a moment, and the back of my neck told me something before my head caught up. I took 2 steps toward her stall, and she flinched away from me, which she had never done before. This was an animal I had worked with for 3 years, an animal I had touched and treated and moved 100 times, and she flinched from me the way an untouched wild thing flinches from a hand. Something had already frightened her to the bottom of herself, and whatever it was, she was still frightened of it. I turned and looked at the west wall. The barn is a post and beam structure my grandfather built in 1941, and the west wall is vertical pine plank siding. Gaps between boards, maybe a 1/4 inch wide, where the wood has contracted over the years. The work light I'd hung was behind me, so the west wall was partly in shadow, and the spaces between the boards were dark. I could hear very faintly my own pulse. I could hear the heifer breathing, fast and shallow, 20 yards away. Outside, nothing. The smell reached me about a minute after I turned to look at the wall. I have tried to describe this smell to a few people, and I have never gotten it right. The closest I can come is this: take the smell of something sweet, not a good sweet, but a heavy sweet, the sweetness of meat that has been too long in the warm, and put under it something chemical and mineral, like hot copper or the air around a transformer. Put those 2 things together and let them settle into the back of your sinuses and stay there. That smell reached me from the direction of the west wall, and it was not a smell that belonged to this farm, to this county, or to any animal I had ever worked around in 54 years. I did not go to the west wall. I want to say I stood my ground and went to look, but that would not be true. I stood in the center aisle of my barn, on ground I had stood on 10,000 times, and I could not make myself walk the 15 feet to that wall. What I did instead was step backward, slow and deliberate, until my back was against the workbench along the east wall, which put me roughly in the center of the barn's length and as far from the west wall as I could get without opening the door and going back outside. The silence was still holding. I had been inside the barn for maybe 4 minutes. I was standing there trying to think clearly when the first sound came from outside the west wall. It was not a coyote sound. It was not any vocalization I had a category for. The closest I can come is to say it was low, a chest register sound, below where most animals I know operate, and it had a quality of sustained resonance, the way a large bell sustains after the strike, except there was nothing musical about it. It filled the gaps in the plank wall and came into the barn, and I felt it as much as heard it. The heifer threw herself sideways against the stall boards, and I heard the wood pop. She did not make a sound. She just hit the boards and held there. Then the door moved. The main barn door, the one I had come in through, is a standard swinging door. 2 inches of pine planks, face nailed to a cross-braced frame, hung on 3 heavy strap hinges. The crossbeam bar is a 2x10, 6 feet 4 inches off the floor that drops into iron brackets on each side. I had not dropped the crossbeam when I came in because I never did, because I was going to be in here 5 minutes and then going back to the house. The door did not swing open. Something pressed against it from the outside, and it bowed inward, not sharply, not with the impact of a single strike, but with a slow, sustained, increasing pressure, the way a door bows when something very large and very deliberate is leaning its weight into it. I watched the planks deform. I watched a hairline crack travel up the upper corner of the frame. I watched the crossbeam, which I had not engaged, shift in its brackets, from the door pushing up against it from below as the door bowed. And then I heard the crossbeam itself take the load, and I heard the grain inside it give, a sound between a crack and a moan, a sound that wood only makes when it is at the edge of what it can hold. I did not move for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I was watching the second hand on my watch, which I had put on that morning the same as every morning. I counted the rotations of that hand because it gave my mind something to hold on to that was not the door. The pressure increased for the first 3 minutes. The door bowed inward maybe 6 inches at its center, held against the brace bar with the crossbeam now fully loaded and audibly stressed. The gap between the door's left edge and the frame opened up on the inward bow, maybe an inch, maybe a little more, and through that gap the outside came in, cold air, the smell stronger now, heavy and insistent, and light, faint, gray, pre-dawn, enough to show me that something was there. I will tell you what I saw through that gap in the time I had to look at it, and I will only tell you what I actually saw, and not one thing more. Height first. The gap was between roughly 4 feet off the floor and 6 feet off the floor, which is what the bowed door exposed. And what I could see through it at that height was not empty air, was not a dark tree line, was not open barnyard. It was occupied. Something stood there on the other side of that door in the last dark before dawn, and it was tall enough that I could not see sky above it through a gap that should have shown me sky, fur, or something close to it. Dark, not black, but dark. The kind of brown black you get on a very old tree trunk or on cured tobacco. The texture I could see was not smooth. It was coarse, directional, lying in the same direction the way an animal's coat lays, but in strands that were too thick and too widely spaced to belong to anything I had ever touched. I had my hand on the grip of the folding knife I carried in my coat pocket, and I was not aware of having put it there. The smell was coming through the gap in a steady pour. Then the eye, I do not know how else to say it. I was looking at the gap in the door, and I was seeing the fur and the dark shape, and then there was an eye. It was at the top of the gap, which put it at roughly 5.5 to 6 feet off the ground, which means the eye was at that height, and the head it belonged to was higher still. The eye was forward-facing, not side-facing the way a deer's or a cow's eye sits, and it caught the faint light the way eyes catch light in the dark. That flat surface reflection you see when you hold a flashlight toward an animal at night. Except I was not shining any light toward it. The light was its own, a dim amber, and it was still. It did not move. It was looking at the inside of this barn through the gap it had made, and there was nothing dull about it. There was nothing confused or random in it. It was looking at me. I want to be precise about this next part because it is the part that I have spent 4 years trying to find a framework for and cannot. I am a man who has spent his life with animals. I know what it is to be looked at by an animal that is assessing you, whether the animal is deciding whether you are a threat or deciding whether you are prey. Those are different kinds of looking, and they produce different feelings in the man being looked at. What came through that gap in the door was not either one of those things. What came through was recognition, not threat assessment, not predator calculation, something that understood that I was a specific kind of creature standing in a specific position in a specific building, and that found that worth its sustained attention. I do not know what to do with that. I have never known what to do with it. The pressure held for another 5 minutes. The crossbeam held, though I could hear the strain in it. A low, continuing creak, like a boat timber in a slow swell. The eye did not look away. I did not look away. I stood at the workbench with my back against the lumber shelf and my hand on my knife, and I breathed as slowly and as quietly as I could, and I watched, and I counted the seconds on my watch, and I waited. At 11 minutes past the first time I had marked the watch, the pressure released. Not gradually, not in stages. The door shifted back to plumb over about 3 seconds. The weight coming off it the way a hand comes off a surface, and the crack and the creak of the crossbeam went quiet, and the gap closed back down to the 1/4-inch gap it was designed to have. The smell did not stop immediately. It was another 2 or 3 minutes before it began to thin, and maybe 5 more before it was mostly gone, leaving only a trace of it that I could still find if I breathed in carefully, caught in the hay dust and the old wood. The heifer was still in the corner of her stall. She did not move for a long time after the pressure left. I stood at the workbench for another 15 minutes before I went to the door and put my hand on it. The outside wood was cold. That sounds like a simple thing, but cold in a specific way. The way a surface is cold when something has been pressing against it in the night air for a long time, drawing heat out through contact. The outside face of the planks was colder than the inside face by enough that I noticed it with my fingers. I opened the door and stood in the frame and looked out at the barnyard in the first gray of dawn. Nothing was there. The gravel between the barn and the house showed my own boot prints from 40 minutes earlier, the clear press of my work boots in the frost that had settled on the upper surfaces of the stones. Around the outside of the west wall, where I walked next, the ground was softer, a strip of bare soil along the foundation, and there was disturbance there, not a clear track, not anything I could have photographed and shown someone and had it stand up, but disturbance. Compressed soil in an irregular pattern, the frost pushed down and the dark earth showing through, in a span that was wider than any single thing I could account for. I stood there and looked at it for a while. Then I walked around to the east side of the barn and I looked out toward the southern tree line, 200 yards off across the near pasture. There was nothing at the tree line. I found Cleet under the truck. He was lying flat on his belly in the wheel well of the rear passenger side, as far back and as low as he could get, his chin on his front paws and his eyes tracking me when I crouched down to look in at him. He was alive, and he was whole, and he was not coming out. I talked to him in a plain voice and told him it was all right. And he looked at me with his old eyes and did not believe me. I left him there and went into the house. Denny was up making coffee at the counter, still in his long underwear and his wool socks. He looked at me when I came in and he said, "Heifer doing any better?" I stood in the doorway and I said she was holding. He said, "You look like you haven't slept." I said I'd been up a while. I poured the rest of my first cup of coffee down the drain, and I poured a new one, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I listened to Denny talk about whether to try the east blind again or walk the creek bottom. And I said I thought the creek bottom would be good. And none of it was real to me. I was still in the barn. Part of me has never fully left the barn. Denny packed his things and drove home around 9 that morning. Before he pulled out, he said, "Karen wanted me to come down for Thanksgiving," and I said I'd see. He asked if everything was all right, and I said it was fine. I watched his truck go down the gravel drive and turn out onto the county road, and then I stood in the yard for a long time. I never told him. He asked me once, maybe 2 months later on the phone, if anything strange had happened that weekend, because he thought about that Saturday night and the sounds and Cleet being squirrely. I told him the coyotes had been running hard in the rut and Cleet was getting old. Denny said he figured. We moved on. I haven't found a way to begin the conversation that would need to happen for him to understand what I am telling you now, and I do not think I ever will. I called Walt Graber that Monday afternoon. Walt is 81 years old and has farmed the property north of mine since before I was born. His family goes back in this county to when it was still carved out of the mountain, and he has heard things across a long life that most people around here have not bothered to listen for. I have always respected Walt. He does not talk much, and he does not make things up. I told him what had happened. The sounds on Saturday, the heifer's condition, the smell, the door. I told him what I'd seen through the gap. He was quiet for a while after I finished. Then he said, "Clinch Mountain." I said, "Yes," he said. "There's been things up in those hollows since my daddy's time." Then he said he had to go check his water line before dark, and he said goodbye, and he hung up. That was the whole of it. I have not brought it up with him again, and he has not brought it up with me. I do not think he will. I took the heifer to the vet on Tuesday. She was physically sound, no injury, no illness I had been missing. The vet said the lathering was consistent with acute stress and that she should settle down when she was back in a familiar routine. He looked at me a little sideways when I mentioned how frightened she had seemed, and I told him I thought something had been in the barnyard during the night. He said predator presence would do it, and I said, yes, and I paid the bill and brought her home. She never settled around that barn again the way she had before. Not fully. She would enter it and she would eat from the bucket and she would let me work around her, but she always positioned herself to face the west wall and she always watched it. I noticed this every time I was in there with her for the next several months, and I stopped trying to explain it away somewhere around March. Cleet came out from under the truck by the end of that Sunday. He ate his dinner that evening off the porch and slept by the back door. For the rest of his life, which was another 2 years, He would not go past the near pasture fence on the west side. I tried walking him out that direction a handful of times in the spring of 2020, and each time he stopped at that fence line and sat down and looked at me with an expression that I had never seen on him in 14 years and that I do not have a word for. I stopped trying. He died in October of 2021 in the sun on the back porch in the morning. He had a good long life, and I was with him at the end, and I am grateful for that. I have not walked the far pasture fence on the west side myself since that Sunday. I tell myself it is because there is no practical reason to, that I keep my stock in the near pasture now, and the far field is in hay and does not need regular walking. That is true as far as it goes. It does not go all the way. A few things have changed about how I work this farm and how I move through the nights. I close the barn doors now full close, the bar down and the brackets seated, every time I go in after dark, which I did not used to do. I do not walk the barnyard after 11 at night without my rifle, a lever action 30-30 that belonged to my father, which I used to carry only during deer season. I sleep lighter than I did. Not badly. Not in a way that has cost me anything I could put a number to, but lighter. With one part of me listening even when the rest is down. My daughter Lena visited in February of 2020 and commented that I seemed quieter than she remembered, and I told her I was just tired, which was not untrue. I've not told Lena. There are people who hear a story like this and want to give it a name, put it in a category, match it up with something they read in a book or saw on a television show. I understand that. Categories are how we manage things. I have categories for everything on this farm, a lifetime of them. I do not have a category for what stood outside my barn door in the dark of November 17th, 2019. I am not going to pretend I do. What I have is the Crossbeam. I went in last week, Tuesday morning, to check on a water line running to the east stall. And I stopped under it the way I always do now when I come through that door. The crack runs along the grain on the left side, 14 inches from the south bracket. The wood around it has darkened over 4 years the way old pine darkens, and the crack itself has stayed at 14 inches, has not traveled further. It does not need replacing in any structural sense. The barn stands fine, the brackets hold. I could get a new piece of 2x10 at the hardware in town and have it swapped in a morning, and the barn would look the same and work the same. I have not gotten around to it. The nail my father drove into that beam the year I was born is still there too, a couple feet east of the crack. And sometimes I stand in the barn in the morning with my coffee, and I look at both of them, the old nail and the new damage, and I think about the kind of man I was before that Sunday and the kind I have been since. I do not think they are entirely different men. I think one of them just knows something the other one didn't. The crack in the crossbeam is 6 feet 4 inches off the floor. I can reach it without standing on anything. I ran my finger along it this past Tuesday the way I do sometimes, feeling the split grain and the rough edge where the wood gave. It is cold in the barn at this time of year, and the wood is cold, and the damage is plain under my hand. I leave it there. I leave it because it is the one thing I have that is exactly what it is, that does not need my explanation or my category or my considered opinion about what might have made it. Something put enough of itself against that door to bow the planks and crack the beam and stand in the gap and look at me with its own light in the dark. It did that. The beam holds the proof of it. That is the only thing I know how to say.